Hello and welcome. My name is Jackie and tonight I'm going to be sharing some watercolor techniques. I'm just going to turn this camera and I'm using a piece of watercolor paper that I've created 12 different squares on my paper just to have some nice neat spaces for my different techniques that I'm going to discover and play with tonight. Going over the paper, watercolor has two different types of paper. It is either cold press or hot press. Cold press, think of being cold and having goosebumps. So it's a little bumpy. Hot press is a smooth finish. And it really just depends on what you're creating or what you like. Also tonight I'm using Winsor Newton watercolors. What I love about these is you can order these little cakes individually. So if you run out of one or if you want different colors, you can definitely buy them individually. I also have a cup of water, paper towel, some masking tape, my brushes, Q-tips, pencil. I have some salt. And I also have some rubbing alcohol. So those are the materials that I will be using tonight on this little demonstration. All right, let's begin. The first thing, whenever I'm picking up a new medium, and in this case it's watercolor, I really want to get to know that medium. What does it do? What does it do? What are the rules? What rules can I break? And what can I create from it? What can I make up with this medium? So the first thing I like to do is try it all out. And then I have this lovely map that when I'm creating something and I'm like, oh, how am I going to get that look? I have something to go back to and look at for examples of those techniques. So the first technique I'm going to be doing tonight is brush marks, right? You got to know how to use the brush with the medium, what happens when you push down hard, lift up, just to get a feel of moving that paint on the surface of your paper. So this may come out backwards, but I'm going to just write brush marks. And I'm going to just say thick and thin. So thick and thin lines we'll focus on today. I'm going to grab just a brush that makes me happy, but of course we can talk about brushes another time. But I'm just going to use this liner brush. And we're going to start with our lines. So of course every brush creates a different mark, right? So our round tip, our filbert, our flat top, those are all going to create different marks. But just to start with one, you can totally do them all the brushes you have and see what they do. I would highly suggest that. But tonight I'm just going to start with this guy here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to awake my cake. So with my watercolor, I'm going to dip my paintbrush into the water and I'm just going to gently move that paint on the surface. And what I find that a lot of people do is they keep going back to that cake. But what I like to do is put it over to the side on my mixing plate. Now you could use a paper plate, you could use the cover of your watercolor or a palette that you have. And I'm just going to create this little puddle of paint right here. And that's what I'm going to be dipping into for the most part, back into this little puddle rather than into my cake because there's no need to like scoop or gouge or whatever. We're just getting a little bit of that pigment and adding the water right over here. Alrighty, so back to our paper. I am going to start adding or holding my brush. I hold it like a pen or a pencil most of the time, and I'm going to just see what happens. If I put my paintbrush down, can I get a thick line? If I push down hard, oh, it kind of runs out of paint. Interesting. We're just kind of seeing what it does. Maybe just using the tips of your bristles, can you get a really thin line? What if I go back and forth? Just take some time. You even can have another piece of paper and just kind of play and see what can happen, what you can achieve, what your paint does, what your paintbrushes do. Maybe even having a piece of paper with all your different types of brushes and then doing different swatches of those to see what each brush does. It's just kind of fun and it's a good exercise. So I'm going to see if I can get a thick, more pressure, lifting up, thin, thick, thin. Just kind of playing with that pressure. Those kind of look like leaves, right? That's interesting. So I would take some time, pause this video if you'd like, and go ahead and see what kind of marks you can create with your paintbrush and your watercolor. All right, our next little square is going to be, grab my pencil, it's going to be wet on dry. Wet on dry. And then you're like, what the heck is that? Well, it is when my paper is dry and my paint, of course, is watercolor, so it's wet. And what happens? Can I make a line? Okay. Can I make a shape? I'll make a heart. What if I make a heart and fill it in? Can I write a letter? So I have a line, I have a shape filled in, a shaped outline, and a letter. So that is an example of wet paint on dry paper. So I noticed that it really just went where my paintbrush was. It didn't go elsewhere. It stayed where it was, and the paper kind of soaked up my my paint. So I kind of ran out of paint quite fast. Okay, next little square. We're gonna do wet on wet. Alrighty, what the heck is that? Well, I'm gonna take another brush and I'm gonna dip it on into some water, tap it off on your paper towel, and I'm going to just give my square a little painting of water. So I'm just gonna go and paint with my paintbrush just with water, so it's just getting wet. All right. Same thing. I'm gonna dip on into that puddle of paint I created, and I'm gonna create the same thing but on this one. Let's see what happens. I'm gonna add my line. I'm gonna do a letter. I'm gonna dip back in my paint. I'm gonna do outline. I'm gonna fill in. And I'm just gonna give it a little bit of a fill right here. So immediately I notice it's a lot less saturated. It bled and it's blurry. Interesting. So I could see that helping with blending colors and creating some soft feelings. So wet on dry, wet on wet. Definitely a different look. Alrighty, let's try a little bit of a value scale. I do suggest taking a little bit more time practicing this, but just always to get started, our value scale. So we're focusing on light to dark of one color. So I am going to use the same color and I'm going to add some more pigment to that. And I'm just going to go ahead and I added a little bit more water to my brush. So my next little rectangle is going to be a little bit lighter. And let's see, adding more water, less pigment. A little bit lighter. And one more. Nice and light. So there I have dark to light. I have a lot of different looks from just one color. And of course, now we can say that I did that wet on dry. All right, excellent. My next one is going to be noticing a soft edge. So what's a soft edge? Soft edge, we're going to put some paint on our brush. And I'm going to create a little square. I'm just kind of filling it in. I'm filling in, and I'm not drawing the square and filling it in. I'm more filling as I go. I'm going to create maybe like a leaf shape. And maybe a circle. All right, so we're noticing that the edges aren't perfect. They're not a straight little line like we're going to try to get over on our next spot. Then we'll come back and we're going to look at both the soft edge and then a hard edge. All right, so a hard edge, I would want a little bit more control, a little bit more detail. So let's go ahead and I'm going to draw my shape. I'm going to fill in. And I'm going to do the same thing with my leaf shape and the same thing with my circle. And then we'll compare. All right, so looking at both of these, our hard edge and our soft edge, would be interesting is in a picture, something that's in the background might be a little bit more blurry, out of focus. Maybe I would want a soft edge, something that is close in the foreground, right in front of me. I'd want to see crisp edges, which would be a hard edge here. What if we kind of layered some soft edges, then added hard edges in front of it? That would give depth to our picture. So it's always nice to think about, well, what is most important? What needs to have more detail or be more crisp? And that would be our hard edge. Soft edge would create a little bit more of a softer, maybe blurrier feel. And of course, some things are soft and fluffy, which a soft edge could create, and something like a marble would have nice crisp outline as it is just a hard surface. All right, my friends, let's go for layers. So when painting with watercolor, there's a lot of being patient and a lot of letting things dry and having the opportunity to build on one color. So when painting, I could totally just go ahead and say, all right, this is my sky. I'm gonna just have it pure blue like that. Or maybe we can add another layer. And you can do the layer with the same color or a different color, and it's definitely going to give different looks. So I'm gonna do 2 rectangles here, same blue. All right, so layering a color onto another color. So I'm gonna add yellow to this one here. So it is wet still, but I'm adding another layer on top of this side, and it's creating another color, right? It's mixing right on there, which is interesting. Now I'm gonna leave this one dry for now, and we're gonna come back to it once it dries. I'm gonna leave it as is, come back when it's dry. Now I did another color on top of wet paint, which blended, so it created a green. Now let's go ahead and see what happens when I add the same color while it's still kind of dry or wet. That's interesting. So if I have, if I don't fill in that whole space, it blends in, but I also see a light and a dark. So adding layers adds interest. We could even add another layer here. Remember, we're gonna come back once this dries in just a moment and see what happens when you layer, when you wait and layer when it is dry. So our next little square, we're gonna talk about mixing. We did just kind of see a little bit of mixing over here, but let's look into that a little bit more. Alrighty. So I'm going to put down some red. And I'm going to add some yellow. And it's creating an orange. So I have red, orange, and then I have some yellow here. And of course, you can mix on your palette or on your plate, whatever you're using, right on there, and then apply it to your picture as well. So you can mix on your artwork, or if you're like, ooh, I really need this orange, but I want it to be over here, I would mix it on my palette and then bring it up over here. So you can play with all different colors and make some beautiful mixes. And look how beautiful that is. While it's drying, it's kind of creating a marbly tie-dye effect, which is really cool. All right, moving along. Don't forget, we're coming back to that layer. All right, this is a fun little square. This is going to be adding salt. Like, what the heck? What's that going to do? Well, let's check it out. So I'm going to use some paint. Now, also, you can use different types of salt, coarse or very fine, and it's going to create a different look as well, which is always interesting to try. So if you have like a kosher salt and a like just table salt, you can try these. So the paint has to be wet, so it's just put it down. I have my little container of salt, and I'm just gonna put some on there. And I'm noticing that the salt is kind of sucking up that paint right where it's laying. The salt is turning blue. And we're just gonna let that be until it dries, and we'll come back and see what happens. Next one is a fun one as well. This one is going to be rubbing alcohol. Oops, so this is salt. Rubbing alcohol. All right, here we go. So I'm going to get my paint, lay it on down. All right, and now I'm going to take my rubbing alcohol. Mine's in this little spray bottle, so I'm just gonna put a few little sprays in there. I'm gonna grab another paintbrush. You can use whatever you'd like to drip it on. But I'm just gonna do a few little drops. And it's gonna create these cool like cells. And you can get tiny ones, big ones. Let's see if you can see that. It's really interesting, and it's going to continue to do its thing for a moment or so. But that's interesting. So maybe creating some craters on the moon, or I don't know. The options are endless what you can do with that. Okay. This is, I think, is very important, and it's called lifting. So I'm going to write, this one here is going to be lifting with a brush. Now, sometimes when I'm painting, or when you're painting, you're going to have your paint on your paper. And then you're going to be like, oh my goodness, I wish I could get a little bit lighter over here, right? So I just took my brush, I gave it a quick little rinse, and I wiped it off on my paper towel. And now I'm just lifting or just touching. And wiping off on my paper towel. So when my brush is nice and dry, it will soak up. So say I have this edge here and I'm like, oh, I really wish that was soft and not so hard. I can go in and just kind of work it. Usually I do it in like a circular motion to kind of get that going. And now look at that. I have a nice soft edge. So I think it's very important to know how to lift. Now let's go ahead and try with, I'm going to try with a Q-tip and also with a paper towel. So lifting with a Q-tip and paper towel. Okay, let's get that paint down. All right, I'm going to grab a Q-tip. And with a nice thick paper, your watercolor paper, you really do have a little bit of like grace to be able to like rub on it. Of course, you don't want to rub too hard until you really know your paper, but this is definitely something we can give a little bit of pressure and kind of rub. So I liked that. That could be very helpful. And now I'm like, oh my goodness, I really want to try getting rid of that little spot there. So I can take my paper towel and just kind of dab, and that definitely lifts up. And of course, whenever we're using something to do this, it's going to create the stamp of the piece. So keep that in mind. Also, if I take my paper towel, I add a little bit of water, squeeze it out, of course, and then say, let me try to get rid of that right there. And it really did lift quite nice. So lifting is very important to learn and to really see what happens with all the different ways you can go about it. All right, so let's go back to our layers real quick. So my little rectangle is dry, and I'm going to try the same thing as I did above, but now it is dry. So I am having that blue on my brush, and I'm going to put it right on top of this dry blue. And you notice it's just like wet on dry, right? But it's layering colors. So I have a darker version of my color, a more saturated color, but it's staying where I want it to. Of course, if I wanted another soft edge on top of it, I could gently put some water with my paintbrush, gently, because you don't want to mix or lift it, right? And then add my other layer, and it would give a softer edge. But by putting it on wet on dry, I'm creating a nice edge. My paper is on an angle, that's why I'm getting a little bit of pooling. All right, let's try adding the yellow like we did on the other side, or the other, on this one. Ooh, okay. So I am getting a greenish tint. It's definitely, on camera, I think it looks a little bit more green, but it's a little bit more yellow in person. It's definitely sitting on the surface. Again, it's having that nice controlled hard edge. It's not mixing as much as it did over here, but it definitely did give me a cool layered change of color, because if I put my yellow right here, like that's definitely a bright yellow. So it did create a whole new color. So I would take some time and really just get to know each one of these and see what else you can come up with. There's also something called masking, which I'll show in another video, but it is a white liquid that you can put on your paper, let it dry, paint on top of it, and then rub it away, and it will leave your paper white. And the watercolor will not saturate that spot. So maybe adding snow on a roof would be a really great example of using the masking, and we can do that again in another video. Before we go, let's take a quick little look at our salt. So I'm just going to give it a quick little rub off to get those little pieces off, and it gave a really cool texture. So what could we come up with that could create that texture, or what you need for that texture? So again, brush marks, wet on dry, wet on wet, our value scale, soft edge, hard edge, layers, mixing, salt, rubbing alcohol, lifting with a brush, and lifting with a Q-tip and a paper towel. One other thing before we go is we got to know like what the paint does, but I would highly suggest making another chart with as many squares as your watercolors comes with, and doing a swatch of each color, because sometimes, like if you look over here, all these look very similar, but there's actually some greens and different blues in there. So if I have my little swatch, it is so easy and helpful to just look at that and say, oh, okay, I know I want to grab that color there. So that is another little tip. Also, maybe creating a little value scale of that color. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.